Welcome back, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck. With me, as always, David Griscom. Hello, David.
Hey, brother.
How's it going? And joining us now, once again, Brian Box Brown. Brian is an award-winning illustrator, an activist. This time to talk about a very interesting book, The He-Man Effect, which he illustrated and wrote. Brian, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me on. I'm happy to come on anytime.
Yeah, well, this is a very interesting work, and folks Left Reckoners will recognize Brian. We've had him on to talk about weed policy stuff and legalization over the years. And actually, before we get to this, Brian, let's touch on that. Is there anything that sticks out in terms of how this process is going? I had a buddy who was from Texas, who used to live in New York, who was up in town recently, and I've sort of gotten used to New York as sort of a legalizing place, but for him, the difference was quite stark.
Yeah, Texas, I would imagine.
Exactly. Yeah. So what's been going on?
So the New York thing is kind of wild. How all these stores opened up, and then they're doing this enforcement now to try to get landlords to push these stores out, and because they're selling, it's black market product or illicit market product. But here's the thing. It's as much as they've talked about trying to make it easy for small business to open up and for legacy operators to open up and social equity operators to open up. This cannabis thing is like still so overregulated in a way. Like, and I'm not like a libertarian where I'm like, let's not have any regulations. Like, I obviously, I want to protect people from ingesting any poisons and all these things like that. But in terms of like where things can happen and who, how they happen and what block these things are allowed to happen in. And, they allow townships a lot of leeway to say no cannabis. And then, like most of Long Island, I think, is shut out from the cannabis market right now in terms of like local townships saying no. But then there's the townships that say yes, and they get so much leeway to also write another local cannabis law that these, all these other hoops that these small businesses have to jump through. And there's predatory business, landlords and things like that see, they're like, oh, this is a cannabis business. They'll probably be gone. They're desperate for anything and they jack up prices, things like that. But ultimately, what they're going to do is shut down working class people that jumped in. They have the location already. They have the customer base because they've been selling like bongs and stuff for the last like 20 years. And now they're like, oh, we can just sell the product that we've been dancing around this whole time. And, I think I hear a lot of people being like, no, well, first of all, I hear a lot of racist commentary like, that's actually the Chinese mafia running that whole thing. Mm-hmm. That's the Middle Eastern mafia running that whole thing. But also I hear like, they're just opportunists, like trying to they're not weed people. And I think to myself, who cares? This is an opportunity. They're opportunists because this is an opportunity. And so when you're like, we have to shut this business down so we can allow a company that goes through the process the right way in there, which costs millions of dollars and requires like an entire position or group of people to run just compliance on all this different stuff. And to implement, it's like really expensive. So they want people that can afford to do that, selling the weed, not the people who can't afford to go through that whole process or can't figure it out because it's so serpentine. And so, and then they always double down, of course, on enforcement. So what they want to do is really go in and kick those doors down and take all that illegal product and be like, no, you're doing it wrong. And it's just going to be crazy when really like the people that are going to be opening up right next door to them. Yeah. So like, that's a big problem, I think, in like the whole market. And that's not just in New York. I mean, like that New York is actually like fairly like somewhat reasonable on that side. There's states that are much worse where it's even harder. than New York has made it. And there's, of course, a lot of states that it's much easier, like in Oklahoma. It's very easy to get a license, and in Maine, it's pretty easy to get like a medical operator's license, and in those places where small businesses can enter the market, we see the best markets, like the most competitive market with the best prices, with the best, a lot of competition, like everything that like capitalists like talk about wanting to do, like have a free market, let the free market figure it out. Except in this case where it has to be completely, overregulated in the sense that like we're protecting non-users from dangers that they think exist but don't. It's not like it's uranium. It's also it's also taxed incredibly heavily. I read the other day that California, the excise tax on a joint in California is $1.50, and the excise tax on a glass of wine in California is 1 cent. And so it's 110 times taxed at 110 times the rate of wine. Which, like, listen, I am all for cannabis, like, paying sales tax on cannabis, like, that's fine, kind of. California has a high sales tax, but they often do these excise tax and exploitative taxing because it's really a sin tax is what it is. I mean, it's if you really want to call it what it is, it's something that they would do on cigarettes or on soda they always talk about here in Philly, because it's something they want the population not to do, right? So they have these exorbitant sin taxes on one hand, and at the other hand, they're like, yes, we're going to have this like competitive, the best market in the country is going to be in our state, and they're loading it up with sin taxes to start it off, and heavily regulated, and only the wealthiest are involved at all. And it's almost, while saying that they're making it easy for small business, it's still not easy enough to make it a competitive market in New York anyway. And New Jersey's worse, Connecticut's worse.
Right.
And so it's going to take time. And I hate saying that because I hate saying that because people always say, they're like, oh, relax. It's just going to take time. It'll get better. I mean, it's going to take time because it's bad. That's why it's going to take time, because it's going to take a lot of people talking about why it's bad and how it could be bad. And it's a lot of small businesses, in California, they're grouping together, writing letters to the governor and all these things. You have to come in and fix this thing because it's not working the way you claim to want it to work, So that's where we are in cannabis. In New York anyway.
Yeah. It's funny that contradiction, which it seems like a difficult thing to square of. I mean, you mentioned it with the no opportunists. Like, look, my weed delivery guy, who's I've known for like 10 years in New York, I want to think he's doing it for the love of the game, but I also think like the opportunity is probably somewhat the reason he's in my apartment,
right?
And he's just not there to give me the right strain. But yeah, like that, those sort of tensions are difficult because in a certain sense, like, I mean, the things that are put at the weight of this for good reason, right? Like in terms of like equity, but we're kind of also having like, we're going to solve these massive problems by enabling the right capitalists in a certain area. And like our government is not exactly set up to do that.
Yeah. I mean, and that's also like part of what they're doing in New York, right? They teamed up with private capital to provide grants to social equity applicants. And it's been months and months, and the private equity hasn't shown up with the cash yet. And all these applicants are like, you're supposed to be helping us get started. Where's the money? And not only that, they do other things like won't approve their site that they'll choose a site and be like, we want to do here, and then be like, oh, it doesn't fit like this criteria. try this site, and the other site will be like 3 times bigger and 5 times more expensive, and like doesn't fit in their business plan at all.
Right.
They're trying to start small,
Right.
and and that's the whole thing, is that it's difficult for people to start small. I mean, and that's why the traditional market continues to grow, really, is because you can start small. You can start for like an investment of like $500, like a weed delivery business out of your home, right? And there's all these contingency plans in place so that your neighbors will never even know, and they'll never be bothered by it because they would never know. And no legal market really. I mean, I guess there are some, maybe, I don't want to say no, but very few legal markets allow for a business to start in a garage, where every business basically starts. I mean, like almost every business, especially now when you don't need a brick and mortar store for most businesses, everyone starts a business out of their home. And that's like not possible for cannabis because the way it's regulated, because people don't, you have to protect the people who don't want to have a guy doing a mail order business or a delivery business out of his home. If it's weed,
Right.
If it's pretty much anything else, all good.
Yeah, if it's like a bump stock or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, like, I was just talking to my friend who sells Legos. That's his home business. And that's cool, and it doesn't bother his neighbors, and like it's just this little business he started. Maybe one day he'll open a huge commercial store with all these Legos and invest $1 million in this thing, but that's not how really any business starts. Like very few businesses start at the top. You got to start at the bottom. Apple and Google all start. They all started in the garage. They all started as home businesses.
Absolutely. Well, Brian, let's move on now. I want to share the cover here. He-Man, How American Toymakers Sold Your Childhood. And I gotta say, like, this sounded interesting, but to me when you first told me about it, but I didn't really sort of have a sense of the scope of this. And this is an amazing one. It's like it helps you, it recontextualizes my childhood. I remember playing with like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle walkie-talkies and GI Joes. And I also think if you're parents with kids, like I think being able to understand toys as propaganda objects is very interesting. Before we get to the He-Man toys of it, Brian, you start with Edward Bernays. Who was Bernays?
Bernays is actually Freud's nephew, which is kind of just like a funny anecdote that he was. So this is all a lot of this stuff is depicted very well in the movie Century of Self. And you get a great history of this guy, Bernays, who basically developed the concept of public relations, right? Advertising. And it was born out of actually propaganda, was like originally that was the first thing people advertised was propaganda, war propaganda, right? And so, he basically saw that as a concept and been like, oh, we can actually use this to sell commercial products, because they had just kind of like sold World War I, right? As this, they had to sell it to the people because people didn't want to enter the war. And he had used all these mechanisms to sell the war. And he was like, I could sell products this way. And so he was like the father of this concept of, I mean, there was always like people wanting, apples here, right? Like he was able to use advertising methods kind of that we know of today, stuff like sex sells, all that type of thing, to sell products. And one of the things he did, big thing in his career, was that he made it okay for women to smoke cigarettes in public. Like that was always like a very taboo thing. And so he staged this big event where he had like this pageant winner on a float, the May Day parade, smoking a cigarette, and like knowing that it would get picked up by the papers and like, and it would be like this controversial thing, but it would sell cigarettes. And he was able to know that conversation was going to happen and get out in front of it and be like, isn't she glamorous with that cigarette? That's like she's being an activist. She's marching for her freedom to smoke, you know. And so that was Bernays, right? Um, and this is, I start the book like that because these techniques of advertising are really like psychological, warfare with the mind. And so that's where it comes from. And for a long time, it was like governed. We had regulations surrounding this, and we had decided as a people to protect children from this type of advertising that we used to sell war and all these different things.
And is this sort of a New Deal era policies, or when were we coming to these sorts of like this sort of consensus?
So it was kind of, we're talking about like it was a long road. I mean, like there was a lot of things that happened in the 50s in terms of like what was influencing children in comic books specifically, that type of thing. It was with the advent of television, really. We're talking about in this time period, television advertising. So like the first big cartoon for kids was the Flintstones, right? And it was actually a primetime show. It was like the Honeymooners. They had it on primetime. And what they did was they found out that they had time to fill on Saturday mornings, and they decided to just throw Flintstones there because it was popular. And they just put it on at 9 a.m, and they found out, kids actually are up at 9 a.m. on a Saturday. And that was like the beginning of Saturday morning cartoons. And like, so that whole concept, they're already finding the child as a potential audience, making stuff directly for the child. It becomes kind of like a babysitter, like kind of the way we now will be like, here's your tablet. This was like revolutionary for moms in the 50s and 60s and stuff, that you could be like, all right, just sit in front of the TV for a minute. I'm going to make dinner. Like, don't bother me, whatever.
Yeah, and I think for like people of our generation and younger, understanding what media was like at that point is hard, which is like very few channels, all under like sort of stricter governmental control, because there was a limited amount of actual like bandwidth to broadcast on. So like you can't just have everybody, because otherwise the radios and television signals would be jammed.
Exactly. So there's like if you were a show on primetime, you had an enormous audience because there was like 3 choices of things to watch. So you're having like the entirety of everybody that has a TV, basically. Like I Love Lucy had crazy ratings,
dwarf anything today. Yeah, like any Super Bowl can't. Yeah,
no
exactly.
Way. They'd have like so many millions and millions. It was really like you had the eyes and ears of the people at that time. And so, they have this Saturday morning block of cartoons, and there was pushback about this advertising. There was actually a lot of pushback about violence in children's cartoons, but that was kind of like early on, and people often cite that. They'll be like, it was all about taking the good stuff away from the kids. They wanted because some show got canceled because of whatever it is. But they moved quickly. This is Peggy Charon. She's a kids television activist, and they moved pretty quickly to advertising, and we're like, listen, kids cannot tell the difference between the show and the advertising. We should get a handle on this, and they did. Right in 1970, they were like, you can't have this much advertising for kids, blah blah blah, etc. You can only have this much in this much time period. And so you couldn't have a TV show that was advertising a toy, because that would have been way over your quota of how much advertising you could do for children. So in the 70s, it was like this magical period where there was TV and there was toys and they were separate, and kids like you know, it was this different time. You know, think about like Scooby Doo, right? Like was a big thing in the 70s. There's not a million Scooby Doo toys from the 70s because they didn't do that back then. And it what happened was they figured out that somehow, I don't know how they figured this out, that media sells toys. And so they started making toys of people that were already media stars. That's where you see like Evil Knievel toy come out because he was already this huge media celebrity. And the big thing that changed the whole game, of course, was Star Wars and the Star Wars toys and how popular this whole thing was. And they realized they couldn't come up with a Star Wars every year. and towards the late 70s, they started pushing for deregulation. Reagan is elected. He installs someone who kind of had like no experience at all. This guy, Mark Fowler, as FCC chair. And like if you look at his history, it's like helped with the Reagan campaign, FCC chair. and then
Republican politics is a good ladder if you can get on it.
I mean, like it's like so. And then he was running the FCC, and his whole philosophy, or the whole administration's philosophy, was that like the television should be regulated like a toaster. It's just a machine, and as long as it's not electrocuting people, hey, hands off. And so you see at that point like a rise in children's advertising to the point where every like 12 hours a day was 100% advertising to children, because even the content was advertising to children. Like the toys were an advertisement. The show was an advertisement for the toys. The commercials would have an advertisement for the show, which is also ad hoc an advertisement for the toy. And then there's just other actual advertising during the commercials. And so, you know, things went kind of haywire in the 80s. And I kind of got the idea for the book because I was at a toy, you know, first of all, I have all this nostalgia for these toys and stuff, right? And so I go to a toy convention and I'm looking around and it's packed. There's people buying all this stuff. And I'm like, this is crazy. Like this advertising they did in 1982 is so powerful that there's like a line of 140-year-olds that want to buy Master of the Universe toys, you know? And I was like, it kind of just got me thinking about like how powerful that is. And that feeling, right? Like that feeling of nostalgia is like a natural human emotion. And it's super powerful. And there's so many appeals to nostalgia. It's in pop, Make America Great Again. I mean, like, you know, this appeal
with video games, Brian, you see it all the time on like TikTok and Instagram, this nostalgia of like, almost like they took away from us the opportunity to blow in our cartridges and put it back in the N64.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
And you can watch this come the generations. I was just talking to this dude about it, that I mean, like, knowing what I know now, I'm like, I could just go to a Toys R Us or something, I guess, or a Walmart, I guess, and buy like a bunch of the most popular toys and put them in my basement for 20 years and know for a fact that they will sell for at least twice what I paid for them, because of you're like Paw Patrol or something. No. These kids are nonstop getting it, and it's in your own emotional memory is now branded with Paw Patrol, and mine has He-Man in it, and mine has Transformers in it. And it's just like a powerful emotion. And when you're setting it up for a kid, you know, they make Disney diapers, you know, for newborns, birth, right? And you know that 10, 20 years down the line, this person is going to be so infatuated with Disney product that they are going to go back and revisit their childhood and start buying all these other things. And when they have kids, they're going to say, oh, I love Disney so much. I love it so much. Like, it's just this powerful memory. I have this passion for it. It's like, yeah, because it was the name of this book originally was We Drilled He-Man into Your Pea Brains. And because that's what happened. They drilled this stuff into our brains, and they've been reaping the benefits over and over. And I really think that Disney figured this out. I think like Walt
Mm-hmm.
Disney figured it out. Like
Right.
his whole life was nostalgia. I mean, like his the first hit he had, right, was Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Did not write it. I mean, it was popular when he was a kid.
Right.
Peter Pan. He played Peter Pan in his high school play. When his idea for Disney World came from his love of model trains that he would ride around his property, and he was like, again, revisiting his childhood toys. Like he had this understanding of how this was going to work. I think, you know, it's speculative, obviously. And we're seeing it in action. It's wild, and it's like at this point, I'm not gonna sit here and be like, parents, never let your kid watch Disney. You know, stop buying them toys entirely.
Right.
You know, I could never say that, but I think it's important to understand just how much you yourself were marketed to as a child, and how much your kids are being marketed to.
Yeah. You might look. You might like that major for-profit corporation like controls a bunch of your cherished memories, but at least appreciate that actually is what's happened. And
Right.
like, I mean, I can't. The amount of songs advertising toys that I can conjure up, like the Crossfire theme song.
Yeah.
Like I know better than pretty much any rock and roll song, and I can like literally like remember it.
Yeah.
And it is wild. Like we have, and you know, you read like a journal from like the 1700s, and it's completely steeped in biblical references.
Yeah.
And that's because like that was the culture that they grew up with, right?
Right.
And now we have like basically an inability to talk about politics without referencing Harry Potter, and
Yeah.
that's a similar sort of dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, and it's the same thing. I mean, if you look at, there's people that are like, I disagree fervently with what's her name, the woman that wrote Harry Potter, you know, the trans
J.K. Rowling. Yeah.
J.K. Rowling. I disagree fervently with her. Would never. This is awful, but I still am going to read my kid Harry Potter every night because I love it so much.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's like the power of nostalgia. I mean, it's like, and other, you know, if someone says that, you're like, all right, I get it. Like, I get it a little bit, you know, because it's like, it's there. It's part of your identity. You know, and I think that's also why we see, I'm sorry. That's also why we see such blowback to things that don't fit the Star Wars or the Little Mermaid rigid idea of what people have, what it is and what it was, is because they played this stuff as children in their memories over and over again, and it became part of them.
Mm-hmm.
It's like an attack on them personally.
Which is like, you know, that's an interesting wrinkle, because what I was going to say, you know, as Matt was getting into earlier, is just like, you know, you read older stuff and obviously people are citing the Bible or folk tales and things like that. And like Disney even jumps in the folk tales. You know, I was like, you know, David Crockett was like, you know, my hero when I was a kid.
Yep.
Disney film. You know, and a lot
it was always, the more I got into this, I was like, it was always this. This isn't really new.
Right.
Think about like now we're always like, oh, it's constant reboots and constant sequels and all this stuff, and it was always that. It was always that.
But go ahead.
All of the Western genre was an entirely a nostalgic appeal to these novels from like turn of the century or whatever.
But the thing I was trying to get at is that like it is interesting that there's such resistance, for example, with some of these reboots to like any kind of change, because you know, there might like, you know, there's a reading of your book and like this phenomenon that I was sort of going through. It's like, well, you know, one thing that is really difficult and maybe different about this time is that, you know, all of these stories of our childhood that are like, you know, cultural, you know, they're touchstones. This is like a reference that we can use that you understand, are owned by like the Disney Corporation or by that corporation. Right. If you try to do anything with those stories later creatively, like you're going to get into a lot of,
and they've been extending this copyright for years. You know, it goes back to the 70s where they were like starting to extend copyright. Yeah. And it's ironic because they did all of their early work was stuff from the public domain. You know, like all of the stuff that made them famous.
And it was stuff like, by the way, like, look, I think there's a nuance to the conversation of how much do we mute sort of unpleasant parts of culture from the past. Like, I am of the mind that, like, I don't think we should subject kids to it, but I do think we should like try to keep some sort of a record of what was actually there. But that said, the original Disney sort of folktale thing was like a laundering of like the original folktales, which were much harsher,
Yeah.
and like much more ruthless than the actual ones that they,
Oh my god,
you know,
Dude,
animated.
Little Mermaid, even, and that was in the '80s. Like that, the original Little Mermaid is a crazy story.
Yeah,
Like, and she dies at that. You know, she dies like at that. I don't want to give it away, but you know, it's crazy. Yeah, you're right. I mean, it is. And we talk about like the Disneyfication. Like that was goes way back.
Yeah. And I mean, just one other thing is that, you know, the Cowboys and Indians sort of playing, there is something that it wasn't like, I found interesting the discussion of violence and the sort of monetization of violent stuff for kids, but there is something inherent to kids because you read Hawthorne and it was either Scarlet Letter or one of the other books from the 1850s, and he's talking about kids doing the Cowboys and Indians type of stuff like you would have heard about in like the 1950s. And same Cops and Robbers is just like the more urban version of that. Yeah.
I mean, like, I'm a big pro wrestling fan. Like, all of pro wrestling plays on these exact things. It's like the good guys against the bad guys.
Right.
But you know, that's crazy because that cements the whole nostalgia cowboy thing. I had a kid across the street from me when I was growing up, and he wasn't allowed to have toy guns, which we were like, ha 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 ha, because I had like 8 million guns that looked totally real with no orange cap or anything at the end of it, but like he would make guns out of sticks and stuff, and like, look at this one, you know, it's like to say, you know, there's almost no way to hold it back. I think. There was a show when I was a kid that came out on HBO called Buy Me That, and it showed these like advertising techniques, like they how to make a burger look really plump on the screen and all this stuff. And I thought that was really good education for a kid because like advertising is something that's always kind of going to be there, but you have to kind of it's good to be aware of how you're being advertised to and what you're being advertised and the motives of the people who are advertising to you. And that's the thing that kids will never really know. And so that's, you know, and that's why this deregulation of kids media has changed things. And it's continued. I mean, I think there was a few efforts to kind of tamp it down a little bit. The Clintons tried to, I don't know how hard they tried. I mean, they did something in the 1996 Telecommunications Act. We see like a little bit of change, like things changed, but what changed was just the content of the show, but they still were advertising to kids.
Disney starts making movies called Toy Story. I think the cat's a little bit out of the bag
like,
there.
Even kind of stuff like, you know, if you think about like the Magic School Bus, like it was educational content, but they sold the toys and stuff. I mean, like it was still advertising to kids. And so that's what kind of never got changed, right? Is that, you know, that thing?
Yeah, no, I mean, I was wanting to ask, like, unless it's jumping too far in the future, like, you know, this new era of, you know, this nostalgia, I think, you know, is interesting. For me, like, I might come at it from a different angle than you might. Like, for me, I think what's frustrating is how the entire movie industry basically has been taken over by like comic book movies and, you know, Star Wars and things like that, because it's just such a sure bet. But I think that's a little bit of a different tension.
I mean, it's kind of using the same type of thing, right? Like superhero movies became popular when the special effects like kind of caught up to where the comic books were, but also it's all the kids that read comic books became studio movie executives, and they're like, you know what? X-Men was awesome. Like, X-Men was awesome. I'm the head of Sony. Let's make an X-Men movie. You know, like that's the same. It's kind of like the same thing. And it you know, it's easy too. It's easy to mine. As a guy who mines it for his material, it's easy to mine stuff that's popular already. Easier to come up with
infantile. it's like it's so infantile to me. Like as somebody who I don't share this opinion too much because like I imagine they're enjoyable films, but like I don't get the superhero stuff. I like barely got Star Wars, and it's just like I miss like I don't know comedies for adults. Like, and we're getting is like 40 superhero movies a year.
I think the rumors of them going away are starting. Really, you know, I think about it like westerns. Like there was westerns forever, and then there was kind of like almost no westerns.
Right.
And it wasn't that like the western just like they were like we're not going to do westerns anymore. Dirty Harry came out, and like the action movie kind of replaced the western as a thing. So you know, maybe the superhero sticks around until I think we're going to see a golden age of manga movies that we are like serious live action manga film. Like Dragon Ball Z really hasn't been mined yet, and that has like an enormous fan base.
Right. Well, Brian, you can get the book next month, July 11th,
7-Eleven.
There you go. The He-Man Effect, how American Toymakers sold your childhood. Brian, where should people follow you?
I'm on Twitter, Box Brown, and Instagram, Box Brown. You can also read my comic strip about cannabis legalization called Legalization Nation. It comes out Tuesday mornings.
Thank you very much, Brian. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you.